Welcome back to the deep dive. So if you've ever found yourself, intrigued by contemporary philosophy, maybe conversations involving analytic thought or pragmatism or even Hegel,
Then you've almost certainly run into the name Robert Brandom.
absolutely. And
Uh-huh.
his masterworks, making it explicit and a spirit of trust. They're just these intellectual landmarks.
They are, and let's be honest, they are quite rightly intimidating. When people see the sheer scope of his work, he's connecting language, logic, norms, history, freedom, all of it, the reaction is often, where do I even begin with this?
Is this just for, specialized academics?
Exactly. Is this for me?
Right. And we know that so many of you are intensely curious about his core ideas, but you just don't have the time or maybe the specific background to wade through, 800 pages of really dense philosophical prose.
Mhm.
So our mission today is, I think, very clear. We are going to try and provide you with the ultimate, clear, and hopefully practical guide to Brandom's entire systematic philosophy.
We want to pull out the actionable knowledge.
Yes, exactly. To answer that one big question, what is he actually saying? And why on earth should I care about it when I'm thinking or arguing or just making decisions in my actual life?
And it is a tremendous project. Brandom's work is really this grand synthesis. The ambition here is to combine the linguistic rigor of the analytic tradition,
People like Wilfrid Sellars.
particularly Sellars, yes. Combine that with the sweeping historical and social consciousness you get from German idealism, so think Kant and Hegel, and then mix in that core focus on practical use that comes from American pragmatism.
So what we're really dealing with is a project that's focused entirely on the structure of language, but maybe more importantly on the structure of reason itself.
Yeah.
And how it all functions inside a community.
That's the entire game, and the central, really game-changing insight, the one thing we want you to take away right from the start is this. The meaning of our concepts, the very content of what we say. It is not determined by what those concepts point to out in the world. Instead, meaning is determined entirely by how those concepts function, by their job in the social dynamic activity of giving and asking for reasons.
Wow. Okay.
And that shift from representation to inference, it changes absolutely everything about how we understand knowledge, freedom, communication, everything.
Okay, that is a huge claim. So let's unpack this monumental journey. We have to start at the beginning with Brandom's influences and really try to understand the fundamental philosophical pivot that defines his entire approach. When you trace the history of modern Western philosophy, you almost always start with Descartes, right? The solitary thinker trying to clearly grasp ideas inside their own mind.
Right.
But Brandom starts his whole reconstruction from a completely different point, a different foundational moment, the Kantian pivot.
And that shift is, well, it's everything. Descartes was asking, how do I, as an individual, get a clear grasp on a thought? Kant just fundamentally changes the question. He asks, how do concepts and norms grip us?
Grip us, that's a very different image.
It's no longer about the clarity of some subjective idea in your head. It's about the constraints, the rules that govern how we use our concepts in public.
That makes using a concept sound less like an act of creativity and more like a duty, an obligation.
Precisely. And that is the core insight that Brandom inherits. Discursive creatures, that's beings like us who use concepts, are, by their very definition, normative creatures.
Okay, I have to pause you there. We need to really flesh out what normative means in this deep philosophical context. Because when I hear normative, I'm thinking of, social expectations or maybe moral rules.
And you're right to think that, but Brandom generalizes it way beyond that. Here, normative just means constraints that are based on propriety or correctness. Concepts are, in essence, rules for how to go on.
Rules of use.
Yes. So when you apply a concept, whether you're making a judgment saying that is a table or performing an action, I'm going to pay this debt, what you're doing is undertaking distinctive responsibilities. You're committing yourself to something.
So the whole activity is about making commitments.
Making commitments and taking on responsibility. A liability, really, to justify what you've said if someone challenges you. This focus on the normative constraints on our judgment. That is Kant's indelible legacy for Brandom.
So if I say the earth is round, I'm not just stating a fact out loud. I'm committing myself to a whole set of inferences and rules. I'm saying that if you challenge me, I have to provide evidence.
And if that evidence fails,
Then I have an obligation to take my claim back. The content isn't just the word round, but the whole web of accountability that comes with using it correctly.
That's the absolute essence of it. And if Kant is the one who provides that normative structure, then it's Wilfrid Sellars who provides the analytic tools you need to actually implement it and systematize it in contemporary philosophy.
Okay, so let's talk about Sellars' influence. Brandom gives him a huge amount of credit for moving analytic philosophy forward.
A massive amount. Brandom argues that Sellars basically moved analytic philosophy from what he calls its Humenian phase.
Which was mostly obsessed with how knowledge comes from our senses, from empirical impressions.
Right. That whole school of thought. He moves it from that to a Kantian phase, which prioritizes conceptual articulation and what Sellars famously called the space of reasons. The focus shifts from how we get inputs from the world to how we organize and justify our outputs to each other.
But the sources you sent over indicate that Sellars himself had a pretty complex position.
Yeah.
There's a tension in his work between two competing views.
He absolutely did. Sellars was trying to reconcile two different images of humanity in the world. On the one hand, you've got scientific naturalism.
The view that wants to describe and explain the whole world in natural, causal terms. Humans are just complex physical systems.
Exactly. And on the other hand, you have what he called normative non-naturalism. This is the view that meaning and reason and responsibility, these are inherently normative things. They can't be reduced to just a description of what is. They belong to the realm of ought, of correctness.
And Brandom has to pick a side in this internal Sellarsian conflict.
He does, and he aligns himself firmly with the normative side. He calls himself a left-wing Sellarsian, which is a reference to Sellars' famous comparison of the scientific image and the manifest image of man in the world.
So he prioritizes the manifest image.
He prioritizes the world as we articulate it with our concepts and our norms. He completely rejects the attempt to reduce this space of reasons, this normative realm, to just a scientific or causal description. For Brandom, if you try to describe meaning purely as a causal reaction to the world, you lose the very essence of what it means to be responsible for a claim.
Okay, and this focus on the normative, it leads us directly to another one of Sellars' crucial distinctions, one that is absolutely central for understanding Brandom, the difference between labeling and describing.
Yes.
This sounds a bit like the difference between a parrot talking and a person talking.
That is an excellent analogy. Labeling is what Sellars calls reliable differential responsiveness, or RDR. It's just a mechanism, a disposition.
Like a machine.
Right. Think of a parrot that's been trained to squawk red every time it sees a red object. The parrot is reliably responding, sure, but it has zero conceptual grasp of redness. Or think of a thermostat reacting to temperature. That's RDR.
So labeling is just a causal relationship between the world and some kind of reaction.
Exactly. But describing is a fundamentally different kind of activity. To describe something requires placing that object or event into a whole space of implications. You can only describe something because the concept you use stands in a web of inferential relations to all the other concepts you hold.
The conceptual content isn't in the raw stimulus. It's in the web of reasons.
It's in the web.
Let's use that copper coin example again. So if I just react to the coin's color and its texture, that's just RDR. But if I describe it as copper, what am I actually doing, inferentially speaking?
You are implicitly endorsing, maybe without even knowing it, a huge network of inferences. You're committing yourself to the claim that this object is, say, electrically conductive, that it's incompatible with being highly magnetic, that it will melt at a very specific temperature, 1084 degrees Celsius. And here's the kicker. Even if you, the speaker, don't personally know the exact melting point, the concept of copper, as it's used by the community of experts, holds you responsible for those commitments.
Yeah.
And that's the critical shift. You've gone from just reliably responding to a stimulus to endorsing a whole inferential network.
This feels like it brings us right to the influence of American pragmatism and this idea of prioritizing practice over representation. It's all about use, isn't it?
It is. Brandom adopts what he calls a pragmatic's first order of explanation. He's following thinkers like Dewey and the later Wittgenstein. The core idea here is that norms are first implicit as proprieties of practice, as a kind of knowing how, before they ever get articulated and made explicit as formal rules or codified knowledge, as knowing that.
So the meaning of a concept, the semantics, is something we derive by looking at how the concept is actually used in discourse and practice, the pragmatics.
And this just fundamentally reverses the traditional semantic order, which totally dominated early analytic philosophy, inspired by Frege and Carnap.
Right. That tradition starts with fixed truth values, true and false, and then tries to build content out of that.
It does. But Brandom says, No, that's backwards. He starts with the practical normative attitudes that people adopt in conversation: acceptance, rejection, commitment, entitlement. And he builds semantic content from the ground up based on the roles those attitudes play in our reasoning.
This sounds like a way you could define a concept like negligence in a legal context. You wouldn't start with a dictionary definition of negligence.
Sure.
You'd look at the entire history of court cases where the claim of negligence was accepted or rejected, and the reasons that were given for those decisions. The meaning just emerges from that practice.
That is a perfect example. The meaning is the role that expression plays in the game of giving and asking for reasons within that specific domain. It's not some fixed entity or it represents externally. And that connects this really abstract philosophy directly to real-life social interactions and how institutions build knowledge.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly for what you called the engine of his entire system. So, semantic inferentialism. This is the engine that drives Brandom's entire philosophy. How does he actually formally define conceptual content?
Right. So semantic inferentialism is the assertion that the meaning, the conceptual content of any claim or any concept is determined entirely by the role it plays as a premise or a conclusion in inferences.
In reason relations.
In reason relations, and also what it's incompatible with. That's the whole definition of conceptual content.
This is a huge paradigm shift. We're all trained to think that meaning comes from reference, that the word cat means that furry animal sitting over there. Brandom is saying that's, at best, a secondary feature.
He argues that reference is a specialized expressive resource we develop much later, really to help us track the inferential commitments of other people. But the fundamental layer of meaning is always inferential.
Okay, let's use the promise example we touched on earlier. If I grasp the concept of a promise, I'm not grasping some external object.
You're grasping a normative structure, a set of rules.
And what does that structure entail, practically speaking?
To understand a promise is to know what follows from someone making one. For example, the consequences are that I can now hold them accountable. I'm entitled to the fulfillment of that action. And crucially, you also have to grasp the incompatibilities. The person who made the promise cannot just ignore their commitment without facing appropriate criticism or some kind of sanction. The entire content of promise is defined by this normative inferential structure.
What's fascinating here is that you're saying these inferences aren't just the ones we learn in a formal logic class, like modus ponens or something?
No, this is a crucial distinction. The sources really stress that these are material inferences.
Meaning?
Meaning they're based on the non-logical, the substantive content of the concepts themselves. The conclusion is good because of the meaning of the concepts involved, not just because the sentence has a certain logical form.
Can you give us a simple, everyday example of a material inference, one that's just fundamental to the meaning of the words?
Sure, think about spatial concepts. The inference from Pittsburgh is west of New York to New York is east of Pittsburgh.
Right.
That inference is materially good, and that material inferential relationship is part of what west and east mean. There's no formal logic rule like substitution or something that tells you that's a good inference. Your substantive expertise with those concepts does.
And that's vital because it explains expertise.
It's the whole ballgame. An expert in any field: finance, medicine, engineering, is someone who has mastered a vast network of these material inferences that aren't logical axioms, but are the defining constraints of that entire conceptual domain.
So when a banker says, this bond is secured by high-quality collateral, she's endorsing a whole chain of material inferences about risk and liquidity and asset valuation.
That the community of finance professionals holds her accountable for getting right.
Absolutely. And this whole structure of material inferences is what defines the space of reasons.
And rationality for Brandom is just operating within this space.
It's operating in this space. And that requires constantly keeping track of the commitments that you and other people are undertaking.
And this involves tracking two really fundamental normative statuses that define our rational conversations: commitment and entitlement.
Yes. So first, you have commitment. This is just the stance you take, the claim you accept or reject. If you state a proposition, boom, you've undertaken a commitment.
And then there's entitlement. This is whether you have justification, whether you have good reasons for that commitment you just made. The entire capacity to reason is just the ability to track these two statuses, to challenge claims by asking, why are you entitled to say that? And then to defend them by providing reasons for them or showing what they're incompatible with. This is the engine of intellectual life.
I can see the immediate practical relevance for any kind of debate or critical thinking. It forces you to look right past the surface claim and demand to see the supporting inferential web. But how does this system handle the problem of concept criticism?
Ah,
I mean,
yes.
if a community's shared practice embodies a bad inference, a harmful one, how do we fix it without just destroying the language?
This is a profound challenge, and the sources offer a really powerful mechanism for it, using historical examples. Let's take the one provided, the derogatory historical term Bosch, which, in its context, embodied the substantive inference that being of German nationality implies being cruel.
Okay, so the community's established practice has locked in this harmful, completely unwarranted inference. How do I, as a critical reason giver, reject that concept?
Well, Brandom shows that you're faced with a kind of dilemma if you accept the concept Bosch into your vocabulary. If you accept the premise that someone is German, and you also accept the conclusion that they are cruel, well, the concept holds.
Right.
If you deny the premise, say they aren't actually German, that might just be empirically false. But if you accept the premise, yes, they are German, but you deny the conclusion, no, they are not cruel, you are essentially trying to take back a commitment that the concept itself forces you to make.
So the conceptual content locks you in. You're not allowed, by the rules of that concept, to use the word Bosch and simultaneously deny the inference to cruelty, because the meaning of Bosch just is that inference.
Exactly. So the only real option, Brandom argues, is to refuse to employ the concept entirely. You criticize the concept by refusing to use it, and you do it on the grounds that it embodies a substantive inference. German nationality implies cruelty that you, as a reason giver, do not endorse and are not entitled to make.
So criticism of concepts is always at its root criticism of the faulty inferences that are curled up inside them.
That's it.
That dramatically reframes so many political and ethical disagreements. They're not just quibbles over dictionary definitions. They are existential debates over which material inferences should structure our shared reality. It's about deciding what commitments we want to share.
Exactly. And Brandom argues that the judgeable, the proposition, is the minimal unit of responsibility. It's the smallest item that can express a commitment. So this whole framework is a relational structure. We understand concepts by the roles they play in this relational network of inference, and that moves us entirely away from the traditional atomistic explanations that try to start with isolated ideas or facts and then build meaning up from there.
So meaning is inherently holistic. It's relational. Okay, now that we understand that reason works through this huge implicit network of material inferences, we need to understand how we ever achieve any kind of conceptual clarity. How do we pull those implicit rules out into the open and actually examine them? And this, I take it, brings us to Brandom's expressivism. If norms are first implicit in our practice, in our knowing how, then how does our language evolve to handle the need to talk about those norms? This is where Brandom's idea of expressivism comes in. He argues that certain specialized vocabularies exist specifically to do this job.
Right. This is the idea of metavocabularies. Expressivism is the view that certain vocabularies serve the unique function of making explicit the structural features of our discursive practice of our reasoning. Their main job isn't to describe external facts, but to talk about the activity of giving and asking for reasons itself.
Words like valid, evidence, coherent,
Right, wrong.
all of those.
And the most important metavocabulary of all is logic itself. Absolutely. Logical expressivism is the claim that logical vocabulary, so words and symbols like if and not, the quantifiers, their job is to make explicit the material inferences that were already implicit in how we used our non-logical vocabulary.
So before we had formal logic, we already implicitly understood that if an object is, say, red and round, then it is both red and it is round.
Yes, the word "and" just gives us a tool to explicitly state and endorse that inferential coherence that was already there in the practice.
But wait a minute, if logic is just making explicit what was already there, how do we make sure that the logical vocabulary isn't accidentally creating new rules? If introducing the word if somehow changes the meaning of the old concepts, then logic is basically undermining its own purpose.
That is precisely the trap, and it's a huge one. Brandom addresses it with a crucial technical requirement he calls the harmony constraint. This constraint demands that any new logical vocabulary has to be inferentially conservative.
Can you break down inferentially conservative with an accessible analogy?
Sure, think of logic as a kind of transparent overlay you put on a map, or maybe a high-powered lens. If introducing that logical vocabulary, say, the symbol for and suddenly licensed new material inferences involving only the old, non-logical words on the map.
It would be changing the map.
It would be fundamentally altering the original concepts it was just supposed to express. It would be like a lens that doesn't just clarify the image, but actively distorts it. So logic's role has to be strictly explicative. It reveals the rules of the game. It doesn't change the rules just by showing up.
Okay, so the goal is to get conceptual clarity about the norms we already have, and to make sure that the process of harmonization, of finding and fixing discordant concepts, is continuous and based on our existing practice.
Yes. That continuous process of adjusting our commitments to harmonize them is what gives expressive rationality its content. It's basically the Socratic method, but writ large across the entire discursive community.
So if logical vocabulary makes the structure of our commitments explicit, what does modal expressivism do?
Modal vocabulary, so terms like must, possible, necessary, law. This vocabulary makes explicit a different, but equally fundamental dimension of our reasoning. It expresses the subjunctive and counterfactual robustness of our material inferences.
Okay, that sounds incredibly dense. Let's break down what robustness means in practical terms.
It's basically the difference between a one-off description and a universal law. Consider two claims. First one, all the coins in my pocket are copper.
Okay, that's a contingent generalization.
Yeah.
If I took a nickel out of my pocket and put it in yours, the claim would be false.
Exactly. Now, consider a second claim. Copper melts at 1084 degrees Celsius. This expresses a law-like generality. It's a subjunctively robust inference. It doesn't just hold true for all the actual bits of copper that exist. It holds true for counterfactual cases. If this object were copper, it would melt at that temperature.
So modal terms like must or necessarily are our way of expressing our commitment to this deep, non-accidental, inferential reliability.
That's the idea. So when a scientist states a law, Brandom argues they are not pointing to some mysterious necessity that's lurking out there in the fabric of the universe, independent of us concept users.
What are they doing then?
They are expressing a commitment to a supremely robust and reliable inferential relation within their domain of expertise.
Okay, so this is the expressivist claim, and it's a direct challenge to what's called modal realism, the view that there are these independent modal facts out there. But Brandom doesn't want to sacrifice objectivity entirely, does he?
No, he doesn't. He wants to reconcile the expressive function, what we are doing when we make the claim, with the objectivity we need, the sense that we are still talking about real constraints that hold independently of what we happen to think.
So how does he pull off that reconciliation? It sounds tricky.
He argues that the world itself is conceptually articulated by what he calls alethic modal relations, relations of necessity and possibility, and that our claims are answerable to these objective constraints. So what we are talking about exercises authority over what we say. We are saying how things objectively are. But the conceptual structure of those objective facts is itself defined by reason relations, by implication and incompatibility. So the job of our modal vocabulary is to express our grasp of those objective constraints.
This is leading us to one of the most technical, but I think fascinating connections in his whole system. The relationship between objective necessity and our personal obligations. The connection between alethic modality and deontic normativity.
This is a crucial piece of jargon scaffolding we really need to build for you, the listener. So we have two things. First, alethic modal vocabulary. This is the language of objective necessity and possibility, words like necessarily, impossible.
And second,
deontic normative vocabulary. This is the language of obligation and responsibility, words like ought, must, responsible. And Brandom argues that the deontic vocabulary, our talk about obligation, functions as a pragmatic meta-vocabulary for the alethic vocabulary, our talk about necessity.
whoa, okay, can you translate that connection?
Yeah.
Why does my personal obligation depend on some objective necessity out in the world?
Think about it this way. To practically acknowledge that two states of affairs are modally incompatible, that it's impossible for them to occur together.
Like a coin being made of pure copper and being highly magnetic.
Perfect example. To acknowledge that is equivalent to acknowledging that if you, the reason giver, commit to both of those claims at the same time, you are deontically obliged, you now have the responsibility to reform or retract at least one of your commitments.
I see it. The objective fact of the incompatibility, the alethic part, imposes a direct responsibility on me, the deontic part. My practical normative attitude, my obligation to keep my commitments consistent, is the precondition for me even being able to grasp the conceptual content that's expressed by the word impossibility.
It's a sense dependence. To understand what necessity even is, you first have to master the social practice of acknowledging the obligation to harmonize your inferential commitments. The concept of impossibility gets its meaning from the practice of holding someone accountable when they simultaneously endorse incompatible claims.
This just shifts the focus entirely from the internal mental state of an individual to the social mechanism of accountability. But that raises a big question. If the content of our norms is based on use and accountability within a community, how do we ensure those norms don't just become arbitrary?
Right.
If the community is where the meaning resides, how can the community ever change its mind or recognize its past mistakes? And this takes us to the social and historical dimension of his work. Okay, so we've established that our conceptual thought is governed by norms. Now we need to understand how those norms get their concrete, determinate content without just becoming a matter of arbitrary agreement. And this is where Brandom brings in the idealist tradition, synthesizing Kant's idea of autonomy with Hegel's social vision.
The starting point is absolutely Kant's revolutionary model of autonomy. For Kant, freedom is not the absence of constraint. That's just chaos. Freedom is positive self-binding. We constrain ourselves by norms that we ourselves impose through rational self-legislation.
And this replaced the traditional model of subordination.
Completely. The old model was that norms were externally determined by some superior authority, a king or a god. Kant internalizes that authority.
That sounds great for the individual, but how do you stop the individual from just making up their own rules?
Yeah.
That would render their commitments meaningless to everyone else.
And that's exactly where Hegel steps in to socialize the Kantian project. Hegel argues that normative statuses, things like authority, responsibility, moral standing, they're all instituted socially through reciprocal recognition. You only become a free, responsible reason giver by being part of a community that recognizes you as one and whose authority you, in turn, recognize.
So freedom actually requires being constrained by a community of reciprocal agents.
Exactly. And this structure immediately solves that whatever seems right to me is right problem. The key is the structure of accountability. It's up to you, the individual speaker, which move you make, which claim you endorse, which concept you decide to use. That's your individual autonomy. But the significance of that move, what it implies, what it precludes, whether it's a correct move to make, that is not up to you. That conceptual content is determined by the community's shared, evolving, recognitive practice.
This reminds me of the chess player analogy from the sources. It illustrates this social exchange just perfectly.
It does. In that analogy, you have a candidate who wants to be a good chess player. So what do? They recognize the authority of existing good players to constitute them as good.
By recognizing their moves as correct.
Right. They voluntarily cede authority to the community of experts, and in doing so, they gain the status they desire. The status of a recognized, responsible player. This reciprocal structure, acknowledging the authority of others to hold you responsible, is what institutes genuine and non-arbitrary normative statuses. The authority is just the social practice of being held accountable.
Okay, now Brandom takes this whole recognition model and he applies it to history itself. Specifically, he uses it to understand how concepts acquire their definitive, determinate content over time. And he uses the example of legal concepts.
Law is the perfect case study because legal concepts have to be simultaneously authoritative and dynamic. On the one hand, judges are responsible to the content of legal concepts they've inherited from tradition. They have to respect precedential decisions.
So that's the constraint imposed by the authority of past judges.
Yes. But on the other hand, the current judge's decision isn't just an act of obedience. It's an active interpretation that will itself exercise authority over all future judges. It's a two-way historical street.
So it's a continuous, dynamic process.
He calls it sequential rational integration. When a judge offers a rationale for a new decision, what they're actually doing is performing a rational reconstruction of the legal tradition. They look back at the whole history of cases, and they try to articulate a principle that justifies the current decision while also making sense of the successful past decisions.
But how does that reconstruction work? It sounds like it could be really subjective.
Well, it involves an active process of selection. The judge has to extrude, which means to ignore or set aside, past decisions that are now deemed irrelevant or poorly reasoned or just fundamentally incorrect.
And they do that in order to reveal what seems like a progressive trajectory.
An expressively progressive trajectory, yes. They're not just summarizing history, they are normatively reconstructing it. They're deciding which parts of the past deserve to count as a rational precedent for the present.
And Brandom calls this Whiggish triumphalist history.
Right, which is a reference to that historical method that interprets the past as just this inevitable march toward the present triumph of reason. The philosophical point is to give contingency the normative form of necessity. We look back and we understand our current determinate concept as the logical emergence into explicitness of norms that we now say had implicitly governed the process all along, even if earlier judges or practitioners made all sorts of errors.
So this rational recollection process is how norms acquire a fixed determinate content through time, even though the actual historical path was messy and contingent.
And that historical structure allows us to explain change and critique and progress without having to appeal to some external, timeless truth with a capital T. The truth is what the community, through this ongoing process of rational integration, has collectively determined to be the most coherent articulation of its enduring normative practice.
Okay, that makes sense. But this leads us to what feels like the most profound challenge his entire system has to face. The challenge from the genealogists.
It's a great unmaskers.
The thinkers like Marx, Nietzsche, Freud.
Yeah.
The ones who suggest that our reasons are just sophisticated rationalizations, that they're caused by underlying non-rational forces, power, drives, class structures.
This is the view that causes Trump reasons, that the space of reasons can be reduced to the space of causes. It's a sweeping philosophical skepticism that sees our cherished self-conception as rational animals as basically an illusion that's hiding much more base motivation.
So if Brandom wants to defend the primacy of reason, he has to have a really robust way to engage with history and the genealogy of error without just dismissing it all.
And his solution is what he calls the hermeneutics of magnanimity. This is Brandom's core methodology for how we should interpret our philosophical predecessors and historical practices charitably, magnanimously.
How does being magnanimous function as a philosophical tool?
Well, instead of adopting the suspicious, small-minded view, what Hegel called the valet's perspective, where no man is a hero to his valet because the valet only sees selfish desires,
Right.
Brandom insists we have to interpret past practices in their best possible light. We should try to see past errors, or even what look to us like morally dubious practices, not as senseless superstitions, but as imperfect and incomplete expressions of the more determinate concepts that we now possess.
So we have to assume they were trying to be rational, even if they failed spectacularly by our current standards.
Yes. We assume they were operating under norms of coherence and inference that, while they might have been flawed, were rational on their own terms. And by performing this retrospective rational reconstruction, this magnanimous interpretation, we can explain why they believed what they did and how their practice ultimately paved the way for our own.
And in doing so, we reveal our own identity.
We do. It shows us that we are rational beings, but we don't have a fixed nature. We only have histories, and those histories are defined by this ongoing process of self-constitution, self-expression, and the institution of richer, more determinate concepts.
That brings everything together, the history, the community, the norms, the individual, all into one coherent, evolving picture that's unified by the simple practice of giving and asking for reasons. This whole structure is really a defense of the possibility of reason itself. Hashtag outro. Wow. This has been an incredibly dense, but I think really rewarding deep dive. We've mapped out Brandom's systematic synthesis all the way from the Kantian turn through Seller's analytic distinctions into the social dynamics of Hegelian recognition and finally to the historical evolution of our concepts. So let's bring it all back to our original question. Why should someone care about semantic inferentialism and these complex mechanisms when they're, preparing for a business meeting or drafting a legal contract or just arguing with a colleague?
Brandom's philosophy provides invaluable practical tools for rethinking communication and accountability. First, and maybe most importantly, it forces a shift in how you assess arguments. Instead of getting hung up on vague definitions or what a concept points to,
You focus on the inferences.
you focus the debate entirely on the inferences a concept licenses and what it forbids. So if you and your team disagree on the definition of, say, fiduciary duty in a meeting, Brandom tells you to articulate precisely which claims that concept allows a person to make and which behaviors it rules out. The person who controls the inferential use of a concept controls the entire debate.
It also gives us a pretty powerful framework for understanding and even reforming our institutions.
Absolutely. It helps us see that law and contracts, organizational hierarchies, moral responsibility, they're all grounded not in some external timeless facts, but in mutually acknowledged and therefore perpetually revisable structures of authority and responsibility.
They're a product of our shared social practice of recognition.
Right. And if an institution is failing, Brandom's philosophy suggests the problem probably lies in inconsistent or opaque inferential rules, or maybe a breakdown in that reciprocal recognition.
And finally, there's that powerful redefinition of freedom.
It's so vital. Freedom, as Brandom synthesizes it from Kant and Hegel, is not the anarchy of just doing whatever you want. It's the possibility of positive self-expression and self-determination. And that's something that's achieved within a rich, complex, systematic normative structure.
So the constraints of language and reason are actually what make real freedom possible.
They are the preconditions. If you want to be free, you have to engage in the practice of giving and asking for reasons and, crucially, subjecting yourself to the accountability of the community.
That is a tremendous distillation of a massive body of work. I think for the final provocative thought, we should circle back to the nature of reality itself, given everything we've discussed about modality and history.
Indeed. If Brandom is right, and the world itself is conceptually articulated by these modally robust reason relations, that is, if some form of conceptual realism holds, and if our understanding of those objective relations is inextricably tied to our social, historical, and normative practices of giving and asking for reasons, then this raises a crucial question for you, the listener, to take away. Does this mean that the structure of reality is constantly being made, not just found? Is the concept, in a very real sense, continuously being authored by the community that uses it, making our conceptual progress synonymous with defining reality itself?